Hi everyone, here we're going to be covering the cardiac cycle, which is the sequence of events that occur in a heartbeat. And it will consist of these alternating phases of contraction, which we call systole, and relaxation, which we call diastole, of the heart chambers. And this cycle will ensure that the blood is pumped through the body and lungs, maintaining the oxygen delivery and the circulation of the blood. We can say that the period between the start of one heartbeat and the beginning of the next is going to be what we call a single cardiac cycle. Now, the cardiac cycle, therefore, will include an alternate period of contraction and relaxation. For any one chamber in the heart, the cardiac cycle can be divided into what we call two phases. During contraction, it will be called systole, which is when a chamber ejects blood either to another heart chamber or into the arterial trunk, which can be the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. And the systole is going to be followed by the second phase, which is the relaxation phase or diastole. Now let's look at this image so we can understand better how the cardiac cycle occurs. First, we'll start with what we call the atrial systole. So we know that systole is contraction, so this will be the contraction of the atrium. So atrial contraction will force a small amount of blood into the ventricles, which are now relaxed. And this contraction will be performed by the pectinate muscles that are only located in the atrial wall. It is important to notice that before we have the atrial systole, the ventricles are receiving the blood that's arriving in the atria prior to its contraction. So the atria is going to be relaxed and the ventricles are going to be relaxed. The atrioventricular valves are going to be open so that the blood from the atria can come down into the ventricles, but the semilunar valves will be closed, as we can see over here from this image. When the atrial systole ends, therefore when the contraction of the atria ends, we're going to have the beginning of the atrial diastole. And this atrial diastole, it will continue until the start of the next cardiac cycle. Therefore, throughout the ventricular systole and the ventricular diastole, the atria will be in diastole. Therefore, the atria will be relaxed while the ventricles are working to push the blood out of the heart. The ventricular systole can be divided into two parts. We have what we call an early ventricular systole and a late ventricular systole. In the early ventricular systole, which is the contraction of the ventricle, the ventricular contraction will push the AV valves closed, but it does not create enough pressure to open the semilunar valves. So this means that when you have the atrioventricular valves closed, that the blood that's in the ventricle will not be able to go back into the atria. And because the semilunar valves are not open, it means that both valves will be closed. So this will increase the pressure inside of the ventricle. And then we'll go to the next phase, which is the late ventricular systole, where there's going to be enough pressure inside of the ventricle that it will exceed the pressure in the arteries, and therefore this will allow the semilunar valves to open and the blood will therefore be able to be ejected. So since it is in the late ventricular systole and systole is contraction, it will be able to contract to eject the blood into either the pulmonary circuit or the systemic circuit. Next, we have what we call the phase of the ventricular relaxation. We have it divided also into two steps. We have the early ventricular diastole and the late ventricular diastole. The early ventricular diastole means that the ventricles are going to start to relax. Therefore, the ventricular blood pressure will drop until the reverse blood flow will push the cusps of the semilunar valves to close, and blood now will flow into the relaxed atria. Now, the late ventricular diastole means that all chambers are going to be relaxed. So the AV valves will be able to open and the ventricles will be able to fill passively. This means that the blood that's coming into the atria will be able to move down into the ventricles with the help of gravity. So where is this blood coming from? So if the blood is entering the right atrium, it's coming from the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the opening of the coronary sinus, which is going to be rich in carbon dioxide. And if the blood is entering into the left atrium, it's coming from the pulmonary circuit, rich in oxygen. And then when the ventricles fill up, they will start again at the atrial systole. Now, if we want to learn how to read an electrocardiogram, we need to make sure that we know exactly the order of the steps of the cardiac cycle. So first thing, we have what we call the P wave. The P wave is when we have the atrial systole. Therefore, we have the contraction of the atria. And this is a small wave, but it will occur when the atria are contracting. And I have highlighted here on the image where those steps are occurring in the electrocardiogram graph because it's a little bit light for you to see. So I added an arrow so you can see a little bit better. Next, we have what we call the interval between the P wave and what we call the QRS complex. So this interval is where we're going to have the complete atrial systole. So basically, it's the end of the atrial contraction. Then we'll go to the QRS complex, which is when we have the ventricular systole occurring. So notice how this peak is much higher than either the P wave, which came before the QRS complex, or the T wave, which is after the QRS complex. And this is because the ventricles push the blood out of the heart with way more pressure than the atria is pushing the blood into the ventricle. Now, another thing that occurs during the QRS complex is the atrial diastole, which is the relaxation of the atria. It makes sense that during the ventricular contraction, you're going to have the atrial relaxation. Therefore, they will occur at the same time. However, the atrial diastole is so small compared to the ventricular systole that the electrocardiogram does not detect this step. Next, we have the interval between S and the T wave, and this is when you have the completion of the ventricular systole. Therefore, the ventricle is finishing up its contraction and moving on to the T wave. This will be the start of the ventricular diastole. And the last step is when we're going to tie it all up. So we will go from the interval between the T wave and the P wave, and this is when the ventricle finishes up the relaxation and prepares itself to start the atrial contraction again and form the P wave.